seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 307, the Pandemic and All-Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act of 2013.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 307, a bill to reauthorize certain programs under the Public Health Service Act and the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act with respect to public health security and all hazards preparedness and response, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts, and the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous materials into the record on the bill.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 307, the Pandemic and All-Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act of 2013, introduced by my colleague Mike Rogers from Michigan, would reauthorize programs designed to foster the development of chemical, biological, radioactive, and nuclear medical countermeasures and strengthen the nation's preparedness infrastructure. It reauthorizes programs for 5 years at the fiscal year 2012 appropriated level and does not create a new program nor increase the authorization for appropriations for an existing program. Congress originally enacted the programs reauthorized in PAHPA through the Project BioShield Act of 2004 and Pandemic and All-Hazards Preparedness Act of 2006. Project BioShield authorized funds for the purchase of medical countermeasures through the Special Reserve Fund and enabled the Secretary of Health and Human Services to authorize the emergency use of medical products. PAHPA created the Biodefense Advanced Research and Development Authority within HHS to help with the development of medical countermeasures and ensure communications between HHS and the developers of the medical countermeasures. Reauthorizing these programs would help the nation respond to a CBRN attack and is essential to addressing gaps in the nation's flu preparedness. H.R. 307 is essentially the same as H.R. 6672, the Pandemic and All-Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act of 2012, which passed the House in December by a vote of 283 to 16. I would urge all members to support this critical piece of legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves his time. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in support of H.R. 307, the Pandemic and All-Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act of 2013. Unfortunately, last month, before the end of the Congress, we were unable to get this final bill over the finish line. So I'm grateful to Chairman Upton and Ranking Member Waxman for agreeing to move quickly to get this bill passed and sent over to the Senate without further delay. This bill is virtually identical to the House-passed bill last December. It reflects bipartisan work that took place between the House and the Senate over several months late last year to resolve differences between the House and Senate-passed PAHPA reauthorization bills. We all know very well that our nation continues to face threats that require an ongoing commitment to public health and emergency preparedness. Of course, I think to my own district and state of New Jersey after we experienced a devastating storm that destroyed entire communities. The federal government's support, including through programs authorized by PAHPA, was critical in the wake of this hurricane disaster. The legislation before us today reauthorizes programs and activities first established as part of the Public Health Security and Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Act of 2002, the 2004 Project BioShield Act, and the 2006 Pandemic and All-Hazards Preparedness Act. Over the past decade, these programs have represented comprehensive efforts to prepare for and respond to public health emergencies. And as a result of the investments that followed, our nation is better equipped to respond to public health emergencies. I just wanted to take a few moments to highlight ways that H.R. 307 will continue the progress we've made over the past decade. First, the bill further facilitates the development of medical countermeasures through emphasizing medical countermeasures advancement in the National Health Security Strategy, requiring the development of a 5-year budget analysis of the countermeasure enterprises, and calling for the development of a countermeasure strategy and implementation plan. Second, it bolsters the nation's medical and public health preparedness and response infrastructure, including through a new authority that would allow states to deploy personnel funded through federal programs to the areas within their state where they're most needed in the aftermath of a disaster. And third, it strengthens and clarifies the position of Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response as the lead for HHS on emergency preparedness and response, and calls for streamlining and better coordinating HHS preparedness grants with those of other departments. And finally, it places even greater emphasis on the special needs of pediatric and other at-risk populations in preparing for and responding to public health emergencies. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 307 improves FDA's emergency response capabilities. It will enable FDA to authorize the distribution and use of medical countermeasures in preparation for an emergency, and to take actions during an emergency that will allow for the most effective use of medical countermeasures. I just wanted to thank Congressman. First, I want to thank my colleague who was about to speak, Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, for all her work on this legislation over the years. Also, obviously, Mike Rogers, Congressman Gene Green, and these are different people who've authored the legislation over the years. And I'd also like to recognize the contributions of Chairman Upton, Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Waxman, and Congressman Markey in strengthening the legislation as it moves through the committee process and in discussions with the Senate. They've all worked in a bipartisan fashion over the past year and a half to accomplish the goals of our members, and they should be commended for their work. And I urge members to join me in supporting passage of H.R. 307. I'm hopeful that our Senate colleagues will move forward on this bill's passage so we can get it to the President's desk as quickly as possible, and I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves his time. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Mike Rogers, the prime sponsor of this legislation.
The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Rogers, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Ranking Member Pallone. I want to thank Anna Eshoo for being such a great partner in what is truly a collaborative effort to get this bill passed and protect our ability to protect so many Americans. And it's been about 10 years, Mr. Speaker, since September 11th and the anthrax attacks that followed. The threat of bioterrorism remains a very real danger indeed to the American people. As we have seen in events across northern Africa, our adversaries in Al-Qaeda and others are still hell-bent on their terrorism acts. And we know that they are interested in chemical and radiological and biological elements to further their political games. Fortunately, we've spent the last decade preparing for those chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats by developing and stockpiling numerous medical countermeasures to protect Americans in the event of attack. As a result of these efforts, we now have numerous vaccines and treatments in the strategic national stockpile that will save thousands of lives if we're attacked. However, the work to protect Americans against bioterrorism is not finished, and we must pass this bill, or the future of America's public health preparedness infrastructure will be in jeopardy. The Pandemic and All-Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act is a fiscally responsible bill that represents common ground between the bipartisan House and Senate passed preparedness bills in the 112th Congress. I'd like to take this opportunity again to thank the bipartisan co-sponsors, first with Anna Eshoo for her long-term commitment and partnership in this, certainly Mr. Pallone from New Jersey as well, Chairman Upton and Ranking Member Waxman, and all of our great partners in the Senate for their support in what has been a very productive process to ensure the health preparedness of our states and hospitals for the next flu outbreak or pandemic. This bill will reauthorize critically important biodefense programs designed to promote the continued development of medical countermeasures against chemical, biological, and radiological nuclear threats, and would strengthen the nation's public health preparedness infrastructure. Reauthorizing these programs is essential to how the nation would respond to these types of attacks. The bill would also reauthorize programs for 5 years at the fiscal year 2012 appropriated level. The bill would not create a new program nor increase authorization for appropriations for an existing program. This bill would reauthorize and improve certain provisions of Project BioShield and something we call PAHPA. Again, I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wish this bill Godspeed for the safety of all of our first responders and those who might be exposed to what we know is a real threat when it comes to the safety and health and national security of the United States. And with that, I would yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
And Mr. Speaker, I'd yield now to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Eshu, such time as she may consume. She is a longtime advocate and sponsor of this legislation.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for as much time as she wishes to consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the ranking member, Mr. Pallone, for his leadership and legislative courtesies along the way. And I'm very proud that as we begin a new year and a new Congress, that this bill is on the floor. I think it's fitting that we begin a new Congress with this bill, the Pandemic All-Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization. Very important legislation, as you've already heard from those that have spoken. I first introduced this legislation with Congressman Mike Rogers, my friend, my colleague at the committee, and we've done other bills together very successfully as well. We began that particular effort in 2006 to better help our country prepare for a chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear attack. All words that none of us really wish to utter. But we need to be prepared. Developing and stockpiling appropriate countermeasures is essential for public safety. And these programs encourage American companies to invest in areas of critical need, because we need the partnership of the private sector in this as well. The bill before us today includes new provisions that highlight the important needs of our nation's children. Children are not just little adults. They need special care and medical attention. They're especially vulnerable to biological or chemical agents because of their size and their limited capacity to flush toxins out of their bodies, and their underdeveloped motor skills and their total reliance on their parents or other caregivers, and certainly the role of the Congress in this to make sure that we have laws that really speak specifically to them. While the hope is that we will never need to use these countermeasures to combat an attack on our country, I'm proud that we've strengthened these programs for everyone in our country, especially children. This legislation is supported by the American Public Health Association, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, the National Association of County and City Health Officials, and the Trust for America's Health, as well as, very importantly, the American Academy of Pediatrics. I'm very pleased that we're once again voting to pass the Pandemic All-Hazards Preparedness Act, just as we did a month before the end of the last Congress. And I strongly urge my colleagues in the Senate to do the same. This is a bipartisan effort, and it's critical to our national preparedness and security strategies. We very often come to the floor about strategies relative to our military, strategies relative to our national intelligence community. This is about the public health element of that national security for our country. We need to move forward with this and bring the legislation to the President's desk for his signature. I thank Chairman Upton, the ranking member of the full Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Waxman, and certainly the distinguished chairman of the Health Subcommittee, and again to my wonderful partner, Congressman Mike Rogers, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask unanimous consent to a joint letter from 4 public health organizations that be submitted in the record from the American Public Health Association, Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, the National Association of County and City Health Officials, and Trust for America's Health.
Without objection.
Now I'd like to yield to another sponsor of the legislation, a gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is recognized for how many minutes?
3 minutes, Mr.
3 minutes.
Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise in strong support of the Pandemic All-Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act, which will reauthorize certain provisions of the Project BioShield Act of 2004 and the Pandemic and All-Hazards Preparedness Act of 2007. This legislation was recently passed by Congress to help the U.S. develop medical countermeasures against chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear terrorism agents to provide a mechanism for federal acquisition of these newly developed countermeasures. Our nation remains vulnerable to these threats because many of the vaccines and medicines that are needed to protect our citizens do not exist. Developing or stockpiling these medical countermeasures require time, resources, and research, all of which will be provided under the legislation before us today. I'm pleased that the language I supported during the committee process was including aiming at increasing emphasis on regionalized trauma care centers. This bill is very important to me because University of Texas Medical Branch Galveston National Lab is near our district. The Galveston National Lab is the only BSL-4 lab located on a university campus. At the lab, scientists conduct research, develop therapies, vaccines, and diagnostic tests for naturally occurring emerging diseases such as SARS and avian influenza, which wells for microbes that may be employed by terrorists. This is exactly the type of research we hope to encourage under the Pandemic and All-Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act. As an original co-sponsor of this bill with Mr. Rogers, I'm very pleased at having quickly moved this rare bipartisan piece of legislation. I'd like to thank Chairman Rogers, Chairman Upton, Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Waxman, Ranking Member Pallone, Ms. Myrick, and Ms. Eshue for their work on this important legislation. The House passed this bill twice last year, and I hope the Senate acts quickly and will send it to the President. I strongly urge my colleagues vote yes on this legislation. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania
Reserve the balance.
continues to reserve. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no additional colleagues to speak, and I would simply urge members to join me in supporting passage of H.R. 307. Hope that our Senate colleagues will move forward on the bill's passage so we can get the bill to the President's desk, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no other speakers. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. It has strong bipartisan support, and yield back the balance of my time.
Both sides having yielded back their time, the question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 307? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8, Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed.